Search the barn. Tear this place apart. Sheriff Leland Knox's voice shattered the quiet as police swept across Walter Briggs' farm. Walter stood still, gaunt, silent, hands weathered by years of labor. A young officer shoved him. "Where's the stash, old man?" He said nothing, just stared at his crushed vegetable patch, his dignity stripped with each step they took. Then inside the house, a deputy froze, his hand trembling on a wooden plaque he'd just knocked loose. Behind it, a polished Navy SEAL Trident gleamed. Beside it, a black and white photo. Walter, decades younger, standing with Admiral Iron Hand Pierce. The room fell silent. Sheriff Knox's voice cracked. "Ghost Walker?" In that moment, every weapon lowered. Every man realized the truth. They hadn't raided a criminal. They had desecrated a legend. The sirens came before the sun had finished rising. Walter Briggs had just stepped onto his porch with a steaming mug of black coffee when the stillness shattered. Dust clouds billowed down the gravel road as 4 police cruisers barreled toward the farmhouse. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the fields like warning beacons from another world. Not one built for quiet men like him. "I want every inch of this place searched. Now!" Sheriff Leland Knox's voice cracked like a rifle shot. His boots hit the earth with purpose. His chest puffed out with the kind of pride only small-town authority could inflate. Deputies poured out behind him, armed and eager. They moved in coordinated patterns like a drill they'd rehearsed too many times and were hungry to use. One headed toward the barn, another to the garden. A third shoved past Walter without so much as a glance. Walter said nothing. He stood at the top of the porch steps, gaunt but grounded, a silent statue in faded denim overalls. His calloused fingers tightened around the handle of his mug, not from fear, but from something deeper. Knowing. This wasn't the first time men had invaded a place he called home. It just hurt more that this time, it was in his own country. A young deputy pushed toward him. "Where's the stash, old man?" The boy's voice was sharp, cocky, fueled by rumor and the adrenaline of group power. "You've been hiding out here too long. Something ain't right." Walter held his gaze, neither angry nor afraid, just unreadable. "Don't play innocent," the deputy continued, stepping closer. "People like you think you're smarter than the system, living off the grid, no paper trail, no phone. That's not peaceful. That's suspicious." Another officer shouted from the barn. "There's tools and fertilizer in here, Sheriff. Could be growing more than tomatoes." Knox smirked. "Knew it," he muttered under his breath before turning back toward Walter. "You've been on our radar, Mr. Briggs. Too quiet, too hidden. Men who don't want to be found usually have something to hide." By now the commotion had drawn attention. Neighbors appeared along the fence line, faces half shaded beneath caps and sun visors. Some brought their morning coffee with them, others phones, already recording, and with them came the whispers. "Knew there was something off about him," one woman said. "Never saw anyone visit. He's always fixing something in that shed. He's probably cooking meth in that little garden of his." Their voices weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Judgment doesn't require volume when it comes from every direction. Walter didn't turn toward them. He looked at his crushed vegetable rows. The tomatoes he had nursed from seed now stomped into pulp by black boots. His irrigation line lay severed, his tools scattered like broken memories. Sheriff Knox stepped in front of him, closer now. No bank activity, no digital record, no outgoing mail. "You think that makes you a ghost?" he sneered. "It just makes you guilty of something." Hutter. Walter stayed silent. And somehow that silence, a thing that once commanded entire rooms, now only made them more suspicious. One deputy began kicking at a pile of wood near the shed. Another climbed onto the porch and tried to pry open a crawlspace hatch. One even lifted the lid of Walter's rain barrel, as if expecting to find weapons or bodies. They weren't searching. They were assuming. To them, Walter wasn't a man. He was a blank space in their database. And in a world that fears what it can't categorize, that was enough to justify everything. As the morning sun climbed higher, the scene began to look less like law enforcement and more like a show trial. A performance of power for the benefit of the spectators now lining up along the fence. Their phones were out, their brows furrowed, but none of them stepped forward to ask what Walter had actually done. Because the truth didn't matter anymore. The suspicion was enough. Long before Walter Briggs was the silent man in overalls standing in a ruined garden, he was a ghost in the world's deadliest theaters of war. Long before the barn, the soil, and the squash vines, he wore the midnight blue of the Navy and bore the golden trident on his chest. Not for show, but for survival. They used to call him Ghost Walker. No record ever said it aloud, but those who'd served alongside him in the teams knew the name. It was whispered, not shouted, spoken with respect or fear depending on which side of the rifle you were on. Walter was the kind of operator who didn't just follow orders. He made the impossible seem routine. Insertions in enemy territory, silent exfiltrations under moonless skies, hostage rescues where success was a coin toss at best. He was always the last one to sleep, the first one to act. His quiet was never weakness, it was calculation. Every second he didn't speak, he was absorbing, evaluating, memorizing. And when it was time to act, he didn't hesitate. But no matter how disciplined a warrior is, war always leaves its mark. For Walter, that mark came on a rain-slick rooftop outside Al-Basra. The mission had gone sideways. An ambush, a collapsed corridor, 2 wounded, and extraction still 10 minutes away. He dragged one teammate with a shredded thigh and another with a collapsed lung through mortar fire and burning concrete. The limp he carried ever since wasn't a wound. It was a badge. But it wasn't the pain that changed him. It was the aftermath. When he returned stateside, the medals came fast. Too fast. Commendations, patches, salutes, speeches. But none of it touched what had hollowed out inside him. The applause felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone who hadn't been soaked in the blood of both friend and enemy. He went through the motions for another 2 years, training others, lecturing at Coronado, standing beside men with blank stares who would one day wear their own silence like a wound. Then one morning, Walter turned in his papers. No retirement ceremony, no farewell party, just a signature, a final salute, and a long drive south. He bought a piece of forgotten land in Tennessee with the last of his hazard pay in VA benefits. It wasn't much, a crooked fence, a crumbling barn, and a patch of earth. But it was quiet, and Walter needed quiet like most men need air. He grew food, fixed broken things, and spoke only when necessary. He kept no photos of the teams. Just one, an old black and white frame of him standing beside Admiral Iron Hand Pierce, both younger, leaner, and marked by the intensity of lives lived close to the edge. And beside it, mounted with reverence, was his SEAL Trident. Not in a glass case, not on display, just there, silent proof of who he was and what he had paid. To the world around him, he was just the quiet old man with a limp, the guy who nodded but never waved, the recluse, the mystery. He never corrected them, because in Walter's world, correction wasn't made with words. It was made with action, with patience, with truth that waited until it was needed. And now, as boots tore through his land and voices accused him of crimes beneath him, that truth, his truth, waited still, behind a wooden wall, behind silence. Because Walter Briggs didn't need the world to remember who he was. He only needed the world to understand what it had forgotten. Walter Briggs had faced ambushes, bombings, and fire teams in the blackest corners of the earth. But none of them felt quite like this. Not like this slow, methodical tearing apart of everything he'd built. A garden that had taken him 3 seasons to perfect, overturned. Tomato vines crushed beneath boots. Irrigation lines slashed as deputies dug into the soil like gold prospectors, looking for something, anything to justify their presence. And when they didn't find it in the dirt, they moved inside. His living room, once a quiet space of solitude, was now filled with noise. The static of radios, the hiss of police breath, the scrape of boots on wooden floors. Drawers were emptied, cabinets pried open. A vase that had belonged to his mother shattered on the floor like it was nothing. Walter watched it all unfold from the porch, arms limp at his sides. He didn't protest. He didn't plead. He didn't ask for answers. He'd seen what happened to men who raised their voices. Instead, he stood there, the last post of dignity on a battlefield no one else recognized. But his silence was taken for arrogance. his calm mistaken for guilt. Sheriff Knox eyed him with growing contempt, as if Walter's refusal to panic somehow proved he was dangerous. And then came the cameras. A local news van pulled up, tires skidding to a halt in the gravel. Reporters spilled out with long lenses and manufactured urgency. Microphones were shoved toward deputies. Words like suspected operation, possible narcotics ring, and militia activity were thrown out with no evidence, just adrenaline and assumption. Walter could see his own image reflected in the news van's side mirror. A tired, bearded old man with a limp and dirty boots. To the outside world, it was the picture of guilt, of someone who must be hiding something. After all, who chooses to live alone like that? They didn't know he'd spent years craving silence because the noise of the world reminded him too much of war. They didn't know the reason he worked the soil was because it was the one place he could still feel useful without causing harm. They didn't care. It wasn't just a violation of his land. It was a violation of his very being. Every assumption, every whisper from a neighbor, every accusation from a deputy chipped away at the fragile peace Walter had spent decades cultivating. And it wasn't just physical space they tore through. It was memory, identity, and worth. He wasn't being arrested. He was being erased. For most people, dignity is something given. For Walter, it was something earned. Battle by battle, decision by decision, silence after silence. But in the eyes of those around him now, he was nothing but a story waiting to be spun into something cheap. The worst part wasn't the destruction. It was the indifference. No one asked who he was. No one cared why he lived the way he did. They didn't question why a man would willingly vanish from a world he once bled for. They only saw an empty house, a strange man, and an opportunity to feel important. As the sun climbed higher over the hills, Walter felt something shift inside him. Not rage, not fear, but sorrow. A deep, bone-heavy grief that came not from what they'd done, but from the realization that they believed they were doing the right thing. They weren't there to destroy a life. They were there to justify their own assumptions. And that, more than any war he'd survived, nearly broke him. It happened quietly, like most real things do. No shouting, no guns, just the dull sound of wood tapping against wood. Inside Walter's farmhouse, one of the younger deputies, a lanky kid with short-cropped hair and too much certainty in his stride, had just yanked open a narrow hallway closet. In doing so, his elbow knocked against an old wall hanging, a piece of driftwood and canvas that Walter had hung there decades ago, more for practicality than design. It tilted to the side and then fell, revealing something behind it. Sheriff?" the deputy called, voice suddenly uncertain. Knox was standing in the kitchen, leaning against a counter with smug detachment, waiting for one of his men to yell, "Found it!" the way they always did on those shows he watched late at night. But the tone in the deputy's voice was wrong. There was no triumph in it, no sarcasm, just confusion and something else underneath it. Knox pushed off the counter and strode into the narrow hallway. The news crew followed, sensing something had shifted. Even the cameraman held his breath, and there it was. Mounted on the wooden paneling behind where the plaque had hung was a trident. Not a cheap replica, not a souvenir from a Navy gift shop, a real one, polished, worn only by those who had earned it through blood, grit, and loss. The gold gleamed even in the dim light of the farmhouse, its eagle, trident, anchor, and pistol unmistakable. Beneath it, barely noticeable at first, was a faded black and white photo in a simple black frame. It showed two men standing side by side in full combat gear, somewhere sandy and windswept. One was young Walter Briggs, lean, sharp-eyed, the same tired gaze in a younger frame. The other man, unmistakably, was Admiral Samuel Iron Hand Pierce, a legendary name in every military branch, even among Marines like Sheriff Knox. The room froze. Every breath stalled in every throat. The air thickened, as if even it knew to stop. The news crew's camera slowly panned over the photo, then to the trident, then to Walter Briggs, who had just stepped quietly into the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stood there in his stained overalls and worn boots, arms at his side, eyes steady. There was no smugness, no, "I told you so." Just the heavy, unblinking gaze of someone who had once carried more weight than any of them could imagine, and now stood quietly beneath the judgment of people who had never earned the right to judge. Sheriff Knox's face drained of color. He took a small step toward the wall, then stopped. His eyes flicked between the trident, the photo, and Walter, then back again, and again. "Ghostwalker?" he whispered. The name escaped him before he could stop it. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. He hadn't even realized he remembered the name. But he had. Every Marine, every SEAL, every Ranger who'd ever served in the early 2000s had heard stories about an operator so silent in the field, they said even death didn't hear him coming. A man who disappeared after a botched mission, but was spoken of with reverence in classified halls. Walter Briggs, Ghostwalker. Him. The deputy who had earlier shoved Walter outside suddenly stiffened, his eyes darting to the man he'd accused of hiding drugs just minutes ago. "Sir?" he began, his voice cracking. But Walter said nothing. He simply stood there. And in that silence, the truth spread across the room like wildfire. The tactical postures dropped. Hands came off holsters, rifles slowly tilted downward. The men who had invaded a quiet old man's home now stood in the presence of something they hadn't expected. Not just a veteran, not just a SEAL, but a living legend who had chosen to disappear rather than bask in glory. The realization settled like lead. They hadn't raided a criminal. They had desecrated a brother in arms. Sheriff Knox slowly turned toward Walter, his lips parted, unsure of what apology, if any, could bridge the gap between what he had done and who he had done it to. But Walter wasn't looking for an apology. He was just looking for silence again. And for the first time that day, he got it. It was strange how fast authority dissolved in the face of truth. One moment, they were tearing through floorboards, shouting orders, forcing a man to justify his right to exist. The next, they were statues, stiff, speechless, their authority replaced by a shame too heavy to wear with pride. Sheriff Knox was the first to move. Slowly, he took off his hat. His voice, which had barked with self-righteous certainty all morning, was now a hushed rasp. "Mr. Briggs, or Sergeant Briggs," he said, stumbling through the words like a man wading into unknown waters. We didn't know." Walter said nothing. He stood like stone, neither inviting nor denying the apology. His silence, once mistaken for guilt, now had a different weight. It was the silence of discipline, of command, of history. Knox gestured behind him toward the others. "Lower your weapons, now." The deputies obeyed without hesitation. Their eyes avoided Walter's. Some looked down at their boots, as if afraid to meet the gaze of the man they had treated like a suspect. Others stole glances at the trident on the wall, the photo beneath it, like they needed to remind themselves that this wasn't a mistake. It was a violation. The news crew, sensing something bigger than a scandal, turned off their camera without being asked. Even they understood this wasn't a story to exploit anymore. It was something sacred, something that demanded reverence. The youngest deputy, the one who'd shoved Walter earlier, stepped forward as if to speak, but thought better of it. He opened his mouth, closed it, and took a full step back. His face was flushed, jaw tight, hands trembling slightly. It wasn't fear, it was guilt. Sheriff Knox finally turned back to Walter. "You served. You led men. You bled for this country," he said, almost in disbelief. "And we walked onto your land like you were nothing." Still, Walter said nothing. He simply looked the sheriff in the eye, not with anger, not even disappointment. Just clarity. The kind of look only a man who has seen more than most can give. It said, "You don't have to apologize. I expected nothing from you to begin with." And somehow that was worse than fury. Knox shifted awkwardly, his voice cracking. "We were wrong. We came in loud, looking for trouble where there was none. Our intel was bad. No excuse for what we did. But I'll say it anyway. I'm sorry, Sergeant." Walter didn't nod, didn't blink, but the message was received. And strangely, forgiveness was already offered through his composure. Actions spoke louder than any speech. Outside, the scene began to deconstruct. Deputies quietly returned tools to where they had been flung. A few tried to restack hay bales. One officer gently uprighted the overturned watering can. The barn door, which had been kicked wide open earlier, was now slowly eased shut. There was no order to clean up. It came from the weight in their chest, not the badge on their shirt. Knox, as if instinctively trying to repair what he'd broken, knelt beside the shattered ceramic vase in the hallway. He began gathering the pieces, cradling them in his palm like something sacred. When he stood, he held them out to Walter. "I'll pay to fix whatever we broke. Personally." Walter didn't take the pieces. He didn't move. But Knox placed them carefully on a nearby shelf, almost reverently, like an offering. As the vehicles rolled out, no sirens blared, no engines revved. It was as if the whole place had been put under a spell. Even the neighbors, once eager spectators, had retreated, silent, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The land was damaged. But Walter's dignity remained intact, not because others gave it back to him, but because he had never let it go. From that day forward, things were different. The next time a patrol car passed by, it slowed. The deputy inside didn't glare or wave. He simply tipped his head in a small nod of respect. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. And Walter, as he turned another row in his garden, didn't look up. He didn't need to. In the stillness that followed the raid, the silence returned to Walter's farm. But it was not the same silence. Before, it had been peaceful, chosen, cultivated, like the rows of vegetables he grew each spring. But now it was a silence that had seen something, that carried the echo of shame, the trace of regret, and the uncomfortable truth that once unearthed cannot be buried again. Walter Briggs didn't speak of it. He never told anyone how it felt to watch men tear through his life like invaders. He didn't describe the way the soil had looked after their boots had turned it to ruin. He didn't mention the shattered vase, or the overturned chairs, or the way Sheriff Knox's voice had shifted from smug command to humbled apology. Instead, he went back to work. He replanted the tomatoes, fixed the irrigation line, mended the shed door. The damage wasn't what haunted him. What lingered was the look in their eyes when the truth came out. That mixture of realization and quiet dread. The discomfort of realizing they had violated something sacred. By the end of that week, something else had changed too. His neighbors, the same ones who once whispered behind fences and muttered suspicions under their breath, had grown quiet. Not respectful, not exactly, but less certain, less cruel. When Walter walked into town, they no longer stared as long. A few even nodded. A few more quickly looked away, unsure of how to acknowledge what they had done without ever having lifted a finger. Regret doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in the way people avoid your eyes in the hardware store, in the awkward stillness when your name comes up at the diner, in the way voices lower when you enter a room. One afternoon, a young man, the deputy who had shoved Walter during the raid, came by in plain clothes. No cruiser, no badge, just him, standing near the gate with a bag of feed for the chickens. "I figured, after what we did, it's the least I could offer," he said. Walter didn't answer, but he opened the gate. The boy set the bag down, tipped his head, and left without another word. It happened like that, in small ways. One by one, people tried to offer something, an apology without the burden of saying it. A mechanic left a receipt unpaid after fixing Walter's truck. A grocer quietly double-bagged his produce and said, "It's covered today." A teacher from the local school left a note in his mailbox. "My father served. I'm sorry for what happened. Thank you for all you've done. Even the parts we'll never know." But Walter never responded, not out of pride, but because there was nothing to respond to. The truth had spoken for him. Sheriff Knox came back once, alone. No car, no badge, just him and a pair of worn gloves. "I thought maybe I could help with the fencing," he said. "Finish what I broke." Walter studied him, not with anger, not even with judgment, just quiet consideration. Then he handed him a hammer without a word. They worked the rest of the day without speaking more than a few words. At the end, Knox offered a simple, tired line. You deserved better." Walter didn't reply. But that night, as the sun fell behind the hills and the breeze rustled through the corn, he sat on his porch and watched the horizon with something close to peace. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need fame. And he certainly didn't need forgiveness. He needed quiet. He needed the rhythm of honest work. He needed the soil, the tools, the small rituals of a life lived simply. He had gone to war for a country that had almost forgotten him. And in that forgetting, they had shown just how much it needed men like him. From then on, the patrol cars that passed his property slowed down. Some officers nodded respectfully through the window. Others didn't stop at all, but they drove slower, quieter, more aware. Walter never waved. He just returned to his rows, to his chickens, to the gentle hum of the land. And the trident stayed on the wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That peace must be earned again and again, and that sometimes dignity survives not through victory, but through endurance. There's something sacred about a man who asks for nothing. Walter Briggs never asked to be honored. He never asked to be saluted, thanked, or even remembered. He didn't return from war expecting parades. He returned looking for peace, and found it in a patch of Tennessee soil in the company of silence. But the world isn't built to understand men like Walter anymore. We live in an age where loudness is mistaken for strength, where presence online outweighs presence in real life, where men who don't explain themselves are viewed with suspicion, and silence is taken as something to fear rather than something to respect. Walter's story reveals something many of us forget, that true service doesn't always come in uniforms still pressed and paraded. Sometimes it's buried under years of dirt, weathered hands and eyes that have seen too much. And yet we pass these people on the street every day. We ignore them in line at the grocery store. We complain about their old trucks taking too long at stop signs. We wonder why they sit alone, why they don't smile much, why they seem to watch the world rather than speak into it. We don't realize what they've already given, or what they've chosen not to take. The raid on Walter's farm was more than a misjudgment of one man. It was a reflection of how quick we are to fill in blanks with our own fears, how quickly society turns suspicion into justification, and how easily peace can be mistaken for secrecy. He had no record, no social presence, no trail, and to a system addicted to data, that made him dangerous. But the truth is, Walter wasn't hiding, he was healing, and he did it without applause, without anyone asking why. Because real warriors don't announce themselves. They don't hang their history on their chest for praise. They carry it quietly, not as burden, but as bond. When Sheriff Knox whispered the word Ghostwalker, everything changed. But it wasn't the name that held the power. It was the recognition that this man they had humiliated, this man they doubted, had done more for his country than they could ever imagine, and had asked for nothing in return. That moment reminded every person in that room, and hopefully everyone who hears this story, that respect is not earned by volume. It is earned by sacrifice, by discipline, by a life lived with purpose, even in anonymity. Walter Briggs didn't need the world to know who he was. He just needed the world to stop assuming they did. His legend now lives not in headlines or military museums, but in the quiet dignity of a man who endured. And for those of us still caught up in the noise, in the habit of judging what we don't understand, Walter's story is a mirror. It asks, how many others have we dismissed? How many heroes have we stepped over, ignored, or misunderstood, simply because they didn't fit our idea of what strength looks like? Have you ever known someone like Walter? Were they ever honored for what they gave, or forgotten in silence? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments, especially from fellow veterans, their families, or anyone who's seen this kind of quiet strength in real life. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story moved you, even a little, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the greatest honor we can give is to simply remember. Remember what he stood for stillness over shouting, for honor without headlines, for quiet strength that doesn't need to explain itself. Because somewhere, just beyond the tree line, a man like him is still tilling soil, still healing, still reminding the world, even in silence, that legends don't always need a voice. Sometimes they only need to be seen.